All right, so topic lecture 2.0 is the name of this. I've been thinking about doing this for a while. I kind of do this when I get home usually, after I've done 7 weeks of camp and really more than that, 8 or 9 weeks of preparation and thinking about the topic. And I always find it weird that we do the topic lecture on the first day of camp, and at that point, your instructors that are doing the topic lecture have learned quite a bit, but we learn so much more once we have the debates and do more research and figure things out and that kind of thing. And so we need to have a topic lecture at the beginning, but I also think we should have a topic lecture at the end that kind of reflects on what do we know about the topic now that we didn't know about the topic 7 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago when the camp began. So some of the things I'm going to tell you, you've probably heard before. Some of you have heard me say some of these things before. That's okay. I think it's useful to just kind of put it together in this way. I'm not trying to blow your mind or come up with something totally innovative or new, but I'm trying to organize kind of the things I'm thinking about strategically as we approach the season and just share those things with you so that you understand how I'm thinking about things, and then you can decide whether I'm right or wrong. I'll offer 2 caveats. First is that my time is limited. I had more notes than I'm going to be able to get through, even before I've had to cut a little bit out sort of last minute. But I think I'm going to focus on the things that I think are most important, and I think you'll enjoy them. Second thing is I might be wrong. I can't promise that I'm right. Some of the things I'm saying are what I consider descriptions of how things have been. Some of them are normative, sort of predictions about how things will be or how things should be. Others might disagree with me, so nothing that I'm saying should be treated as gospel, but I have been working on this topic very intensely now for like 3 months, and I've learned a lot, and I've thought about it a lot, and so I think I've got some things to say that you might find useful. So I've divided this into 4 Roman numerals. The first Roman numeral is the most significant new takeaways about the topic that I have. The second one are some important process-related issues. That's where I think the most important part of this is. Then I'm going to offer a map of the topic. I've already done this with our lab in a previous lecture. And then finally, I'm going to tell you what I think you should have prepared on the negative as you enter the season. So those last 2 parts might have to get cut a little short, but I can share the written notes on those as well. So Roman numeral number 1, most significant new takeaways. And by new takeaways, I mean I thought a lot about the topic before camp started, and I had thoughts about how it was going to go, and now I have different thoughts, and I'm going to try to highlight some of those different thoughts. So first thought is that it's not nearly as big as I expected it to be. It's not nearly as big as I expected it to be. I thought there was going to be a lot of affirmatives. I thought that there were going to be a lot of different countries. I thought there were going to be a lot of different weapons. I thought there were going to be a lot of different reforms to the arms sales process that people would say, that sounds like a good one, I'm going to write an app about that. So far, that hasn't really been the case. So we asked Mona to inventory the camp apps at all the camps that we had access to, which is the vast majority of them. And what she determined is that there are 12 countries throughout all of the camps that have been written as an app, just 12. Egypt, India, Israel, Japan, Mexico, Nigeria, the Philippines, Poland, Qatar, Saudi Arabia / the UAE, Taiwan, and Ukraine. You don't need to write that down, you can figure that out yourself. But that's it, only 12. There are about 5 weapon apps that are about specific weapons, including drones, lethal weapons, tear gas. And then there are about 7 programmatic change apps, so apps that change the process of FMS and or DCS in a bigger way, or that are otherwise changes to the process of arms sales. So we're talking less than 30 apps in total, and the biggest apps were duplicated many times, so there seems to be some level of agreement about what the apps are. This doesn't necessarily mean that the topic won't get bigger as we enter the season, but I do think that the bigger cases are better than I thought they would be, or they are as good as I thought they would be. I kind of thought they would be pretty good. But the smaller ones are a lot worse than I thought they would be, because I didn't anticipate some of the problems with trying to write an app that is small. And I'll talk about a little bit of that as we go. Point number 2, takeaway number 2, FMS versus DCS is not nearly as important as I thought. FMS versus DCS, not nearly as important as I thought. They're mostly the same, and most countries buy from both programs. When those terms were included in the resolution, when I saw the resolution, I had no idea what that was. I had no idea what a foreign military sale was. I had no idea what a direct commercial sale was. No idea. I assume these must be different. I assume this must be, program number 1 has, it's one thing, and then program number 2, it must be a totally different thing. In reality, it's not at all, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later. There are some cards in the document that I shared with you under the FMS versus DCS header that I think do a good job of explaining the relatedness and the difference, and I'll return to those in a moment. I still think that there will be some apps that are program-wide apps that are about DCS. So I think that there are some that are either just going to get rid of the DCS program or significantly improve transparency or make it more like the FMS program, maybe put more things on the FMS only list. I included a card that tells you what's on the FMS only list. That's a list of weapons that can only be sold via FMS. And so I do think that will be a part of the topic, but it is not nearly as important as I thought. I thought you were going to have FMS apps and DCS apps and FMS negs and DCS negs. That is completely incorrect. But understanding why countries choose FMS or DCS I think is important. So point number 3, FMS/DCS key is a lot more important than I thought. FMS/DCS key is a lot more important than I thought. I did not know that FMS and DCS are only 2 of the ways that the United States provides security assistance, or maybe I sort of did, but I didn't think that through at the beginning. And I also didn't think about the countries that we sell weapons to, all of the different ways that we have a relationship with those countries, often militarily too. So we do a lot of things with militaries that are allies and partners. So we do training, we do education, we do joint operations, joint training, and then there are just a lot of other forms of security assistance, and then more broadly, security cooperation. So understanding what security assistance is, understanding what security cooperation is, I'll point you to some resources to read about that a bit later. But I think that's really important, and sort of more to the point, there are a series of programs that seem like they could also facilitate the flow of arms to other countries, but that the affirmative could not fiat stop topically. So the one that I think you should be spending the most time thinking about is the BPC, Building Partner Capacity Program, which is often called pseudo-FMS. It is not entirely clear to me whether this is the same thing or a different thing. It's clearly a different thing, but whether it falls under the resolutional wording, I think is up to debate, but I think maybe not. I think it's reasonable to say that it is not. Building Partner Capacity is a program that was created, it's more than one program, it's a series of programs that were created after 9/11 to have the federal government of the United States basically do an FMS sale, but instead of having the partner country come to us and say, hey, we're looking to buy some military equipment, some defense articles, some services, can we do that through you? And the federal government says, of course, what do you need? All right, cool, we can provide that. Let's sign a contract. All right, we're going to provide it to you. Now give us the money. Instead, the federal government takes it on their own initiative to say, hey, this partner of ours, they need some military stuff, so we're gonna buy it for them, and then we're going to give it to them. So it is a series of programs that have been used mostly for counterterrorism with a variety of different countries. Afghanistan is the biggest one. And it's a way for the United States to just buy arms for our partners because we think they need them to help with counterterrorism or to help with other stability operations. So technically, it is supposed to enhance counterterrorism, counter-drug, counterinsurgency, or support military and stability operations, multilateral peace operations, or other programs. And so, in many ways, the thing that will determine whether you have a good app is whether you can beat the argument that FMS and DCS are not that important, other things are important. Whether those other things are training, joint operations, having a military base in that country, having a formal alliance with that country, doing other kinds of political or diplomatic aid to that country, or whether it's other kinds of security assistance. Do we do other kinds of security assistance with that country? Do we do BPC with that country? Do we build their partner capacity? The best apps will be able to say, nope, the advantage is about the FMS and DCS sales. Those are the things that are essential. And so the list of FMS only defense articles is really important because the list of FMS only articles are the ones that can only be given to another country, sold to another country through the FMS program. And so if you have an app that has one of those on the list, and you can find the list in the document I was giving you, it's under a tag called "Here's the list of things that are FMS only." you'll notice that there are a variety of reasons. So there are the 4 reasons that things get put on this list. The political, military relationship with the end user. Is it a new or complex system or service? Is there diversion or exploitation of technologies? That's sort of like stealing the tech. And is it feasible to separate weapon systems into FMS DCS? Those are the things they take into account, but you'll see that the things that you can only get through FMS are certain kinds of radar, certain kinds of missiles, certain kinds of helicopters, robot weapons, certain kinds of BMD, certain kinds of fighter aircraft, the really big ticket stuff. And this makes a lot more sense to me now than it did when I first started researching the topic. And it's why I think the big AFs are a lot better than the small AFs. The big AFs, this is why the Saudi Arabia AF is good, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. The reason it's good is because the only way that the partner country can receive the fighter jets or the advanced missiles or the advanced missile defense is through FMS, and that's by statute. So there's not any other program that's going to give a fighter airplane to another country. There's not any other program that's going to give our most advanced missiles or our most advanced missile defense to another country. And so finding an AF that can answer the question, is FMS DCS really key, is the most foundational determination of whether it's a good AF. If you can say yes, and here's why, here's advantage 1, here's advantage 2, both rely on FMS DCS, then you have a good AF. If the answer is, we hope so, kind of, then you don't have a very good AF. And so in that sense, I think this is more of a process-based topic than I had thought before, and I'll return to that in the next Roman numeral. So point number 4, there are only 2 major topicality arguments. There are only 2 major topicality arguments. FMS and DCS are very well defined, probably the most well-defined terms we've used in a resolution in my memory. The only controversy is, what does it mean to reduce them, and what does it mean to substantially reduce them? So the substantial argument is very challenging, and the reduce argument is very challenging. The reduce argument is very challenging because that verb is not usually used in this context. You could restrict foreign military sales, you could decrease foreign military sales, but reduce is sort of a weird term because we have to figure out, what are we talking about? Are we talking about an individual transaction? Are we talking about overall sales? Are we talking about the program as a whole? Can you reduce a program? I don't know. And so there's not a correct answer. There's no card that says, here's what reduce means, I'm intending to define, this is in statute. So there's no AECA definition, there's no official government definition. And so what people are doing is they're relying on a lot of definitions from other contexts, from court cases that have nothing to do with arms sales. And then they are making an assertion about what that means for reducing FMS DCS. So that will be a ripe topicality controversy because there is no way to correctly answer it. And the negative needs this argument for a variety of reasons, which I'll get to when I talk about the process. Substantially is also hard, because if you don't know how to reduce, then how do you know how to substantially reduce? So I think the way that this will play out is the negative will say some percentage, and they'll assert that, maybe reasonably, that the way we should figure that out is who are our biggest customers, and they'll draw a line at some point, and they'll say, hey, if you're above that list, above that line, you're on the list above, then you're topical, you're substantial. If you're below it, then you're not. I think that's probably what will prevail, because I think that that's in everyone's interest for that to be the way it plays out. But I would imagine that some affirmatives will push the limits of that, and I'm not sure how that will play out. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Point number 5, I think negative ground is pretty good. I'm more optimistic about it than I was before. I think the supplier shift DA is pretty good. The unnuanced version is not that great, but I think there's lots of ways to make it better and smarter, and I think teams will do that. I think influence and alliance DAs are pretty good, especially, again, if they're made more nuanced. I think reform and monitoring counterplans are pretty good, and again, I think negatives will continue to develop them. I did not understand how good these arguments were, I think, in the initial stages, and watching the debates play out, I think I've gotten a better sense of that. There are some exceptions, but I think in general, the negative ground is much better than on the previous few topics. I will say that one of my concerns, kind of something I keep bringing up, is in conversations with students, is there's no neg ground can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you're debating the Saudi AF, which is a great AF, and you're concluding, well, I can't win this disad against the Saudi AF because the AF was good and the AF debated well and so we lost, therefore there's no neg ground, so I'm going to go for Baudrillard, or I'm going to go for, I'm going to DDEV next time or whatever. I think that's wrong. I think in general, the ground is pretty good, And I think if you have the right mindset, the vast majority of cases have big flaws that can be exploited by the negative. So I don't think that this topic should be leading anyone to be afraid to be negative. I think it'll be a lot better than previous ones. Number 6 is that the conditions counterplan is not as good as I thought it was going to be. The conditions counterplan is not as good as I thought it was going to be. This is a process-related item that I'm going to comment on in the process section. But I think at the beginning of camp, a lot of people, myself included, thought this is where it's at. Instead of just ending sales, we're going to threaten to end sales. We'll try to get something out of the arrangement, and then that'll be great. But I don't think we thought through what that would really look like in practice. And now that we've seen how the debates play out, I think people are struggling to implement the thing they had in their head, because the thing they had in their head did not match the topic. And so I still am concerned that that is something that people are invested in, but that they haven't really figured out how to do it right. So I'm going to talk about something related to that in the process section. Last point, number 7, and this is an important one. The argument culture that we're inheriting with our topic is going to have a significant impact on it. So the argument culture we're inheriting is going to significantly impact this year's topic. And that's a little strange because the topic changes every year. But the argument culture does not. The argument culture evolves more slowly. And the last 2 topics have been what I would describe as neg agreement topics. And what I mean by that is the topics have been contests for the neg to agree with the AF. And they did that because they didn't think that they could defeat the AF with a disad. They didn't think the disads were very good. Both topics lacked a good core generic disad. Affirmatives got pretty good at choosing AFs that didn't have a very good disad. And so the way the negative tried to win was to counterplan to do the plan, but try to draw some tiny distinction. But basically 0 solvency deficit, and then some non-zero risk of whatever the net benefit was. And in response to a couple of years of that, what the affirmative has learned to do is write extremely vague plan text, to try to choose really small AFs, to try to write AFs that just dodge all negative arguments. And so there's been this kind of cat and mouse game where both sides are trying to take away the ability of the other side to have any offense. And so that will continue just because that's how people learn how to debate. There's a couple of specific ways I think that'll play out. Number 1 is that negs are still going to try to counterplan to do the plan. So that's how they've learned to be negative. If you've learned to be negative last year or the year before, or both, your idea of being negative is I got to come up with a way for my counterplan to solve the whole case. That's just what you were taught. That's what you learned. Second is that I think circumvention is probably going to continue to be a big thing. When Trump got elected, fiat broke, or at least our culture of fiat broke, and we have not fixed it yet. So we still have these weird debates where in a previous administration it would have been, of course the affirmative can fiat that the government changes its mind and implements the plan. Now we think the government, you can fiat the Congress, but you can't fiat Trump because Trump is an outlier or something. It's never really said out loud, but we're big into circumvention. So that's a thing that will be prevalent again. And number 3, planicality and vague plan writing is going to continue to be common. And planicality is the idea where you just kind of write the resolution as your plan. Maybe you add a country, and then you just desperately want to not link to any counterplans. You don't want any counterplan to be competitive. So I think those things will play out, and that's why I've identified the next things that I want to talk about. So Roman numeral 2 are important process issues. Important process issues. I have 3 points. Point number 1 is that this is a process topic. It's more of a process topic than I thought. It's partially because of the literature and the argument. The more I learn about the arms sales process, the more it is just a extremely complicated bureaucratic process. And our argument culture is very process-oriented at the moment. That's what we've been debating. So I think it's extremely important to know about the process of arms sales. And so in your document, I've got under the header important resources for process evidence, several resources that I think you will draw upon very frequently throughout the season and that I've drawn upon a lot. The Green Book from DISCS is a gigantic PDF document that explains all about security assistance and arms sales. The companion document is the Security Assistance Management Manual. I've identified a few chapters that I think are particularly useful. I included a State Department explanation of the process and policy of FMS. And then I included again the links to the DSCA FMS notifications and the State Department DCS notifications. So I think you're going to want to draw on all of that, and I'm going to give you some examples of that with my next 2 points. So point number 2, temporary versus permanent embargoes. Temporary versus permanent embargoes. So why is this important? This is important because it gets at the problem with conditions counterplans. The topic is backward. The topics that we've had conditions counterplans on have been positively oriented. So recent examples, you have to engage China. Let's reduce trade restrictions on China if China gives us something in exchange, if they reduce trade restrictions on us. Lift the Cuban embargo if Cuba does something good for us, if they implement human rights reforms or whatever. This topic is the opposite. We are threatening to take away something that the country wants. We're saying we're going to take these things away unless you do something in exchange, unless you give us a concession. The problem is that what the negative wants is really not for them to accept that, because if they accept that, the arms keep getting sold, and so that doesn't do the act. I do think that that version of the condition counterplan can be quite good, because if you can say that you can use threats and leverage to change the country's behavior so that they can keep getting the arms, but just not use them in the bad way, then that could be quite good. But your counterplan doesn't do the AF. It doesn't do the plan. The arms keep going. In order for your counterplan to do the AF, you'd have to say that they would, the country would say no to the arrangement. They'd say, heck no, screw you. We don't want your weapons anymore. But then what's your net benefit? You don't have a net benefit. And so one of the things that negatives have been trying to do is have it both ways. They've been trying to say, I'm going to write a counterplan where the country says no, and so then we cut off the arms too, so it's the same thing. We cut off arms just like the plan, but we have a net benefit because ... And the ... part has not made any sense yet. One of the reasons that it doesn't make any sense is because an arms embargo is inherently temporary and conditional. And that gets into another strange thing, which is that normally durable fiat or fiat is forever is something the affirmative wants to say. But weirdly, on this topic, the negative is going to say, hey, no, you can't ever give arms to that country again because you get durable fiat. And so only our counterplan is competitive. You can't add these conditions to your plan. You can't say, permute. Let's cut off the arms and then say, hey, you can have them again if you meet these conditions, which would be a logical response to one of these condition counterplans, because they'll say, no. Fiat is forever, and reduce means forever, permanent, never changes, can never be undone. So in your document, under this section called Arms Embargoes Are Not Permanent, I've included a variety of cards. The first set of cards are from the US Code, the AECA, and then the DSCA and the Green Book, describing in detail the process by which sales are suspended or ultimately canceled. And then there are some cards from the United Nations defining arms embargoes. There's a card from President Carter. Some of these are in your leverage counterplan file already, but many of them are new. The important takeaway is that there is a process called suspension of the sale, and the suspension immediately stops delivery of any weapons that are in the pipeline. So if a sale has been agreed and then it gets suspended, which can be suspended based on two things, either statute, which are the built-in triggers for cutting off arms sales. That's the stuff like the human rights provisions and if they aren't paying and stuff like that. But also by policy-based interventions. So that's when Congress steps in and says, hey, we're cutting it off. Or when the president just says, hey, I've decided we're not going to sell arms to Thailand anymore. We're not going to sell arms to Saudi Arabia anymore, whatever. And so the suspension immediately stops the sale. And a suspension could ultimately become a cancellation of that particular sale. The way it would become a cancellation is then the sale is just done forever. The suspension keeps it on hold. The fascinating question is, what does a plan that stops arms sales or suspends arms sales, what does it actually do? Does it suspend the country from ever purchasing arms again? Does it suspend the sales that have already been notified to Congress and are in process? Does it do something else? I don't know what else it would do. The weird thing about that is that not very many countries have an active arms sale at any particular time. The major countries do. So Saudi Arabia has 23 of them or whatever. The UAE or Saudi Arabia and UAE have 23 of them. And so in that sense, your plan could suspend the sales that have been authorized, all of those notifications that have gone through, all of those paveway bonds, all of that maintenance for the aircraft. You suspend that. That means they don't get it. You can't. That becomes a cancellation. They never get that. But in the future, they could submit a new letter of request to say, hey, we'd like to try again. We'd like to buy some things again, please. And then the United States could approve a new letter of acceptance, and we could do another sale in the future if they met certain conditions. And that's how it works, because there is no such thing as a permanent ban on all arms sales to a particular country. There are such things as embargoes, so you could put a country on a list that's like the no export list, but every country that's put on the no export list is put there with a set of criteria for being removed from that list. And so that's true at the United Nations level, and that's true by statute in the AECA. So the argument that the negative is trying to make, which is that fiat is forever just doesn't make sense with the statute. It doesn't make sense with the topic that we're debating about. And so it becomes a purely debate theoretical thing. It becomes purely an argument that the negative is making up in order to create ground that wouldn't otherwise exist. And it's why it's so hard to find evidence that distinguishes between an arms embargo and the counterclaim, because they're kind of the same thing. And the authors are not thinking about it with the debate theory constructs in mind. And I think that's one of the important arguments, important process things that I didn't truly understand until relatively recently, which is that whether an arms embargo, whether a plan that reduces FMS or DCS, is that forever, is actually a really important question that I think is going to get debated all the time. I think the affirmative is right. I've given you a bunch of cards to prove that. I have not seen any negative cards that that fix this or whatever, that prove this for the negative. From what I've seen from others, so there is a card, and it is the fourth one from the bottom. This is consistent with U.S. law from the Green Book. And the language that is in there, it says the statutory provisions which set forth such a prohibition, meaning an arms embargo, regularly include the required conditions under which a specific ban may be removed. From what I can tell, the negative is saying because it says regularly, that doesn't mean always, and so neg. And that seems like that's the best thing that the negative has come up with, is that regularly doesn't mean always. And to me, that doesn't make any sense if you read all of these cards in context. I think it's quite clear that anytime arms are cut off, there is inherent possibility in the future of that changing. So in the same way that we used to sell arms to Iran under the Shah, if the current Iranian government got overthrown and a new American-backed Shah was in Iran, of course, then we would probably start selling arms to Iran. But under the negative interpretation, we can never sell to Iran again. And that's just kind of weird. The other really weird thing about it is how could the country ever know that? They clearly could not. And so it's another spot where we're putting a debate theory argument and we're making it have a material impact that doesn't make any sense to me. All right, point number 3, delivery and sales. Delivery and sales. Why is this important? Well, in order to win competition for their process counterplan, what the negative is trying to figure out a way to do is to say that they can do the plan, meaning stop the sale, but still make the counterplan competitive. So do the plan without doing the plan. And one way they've come up with to do this is to say that they're going to block the delivery of the weapons, but they're going to go through with the sale. Okay? So our counterplan results in going through with the sale, but we'll block the delivery. That competes because the delivery is not the sale. This is wrong. And I don't think it's arguably wrong. I think it's one of the most clear things I've ever seen wrong. So in your document, under delivery as part of the sale, I've included lots of cards that I think, as carefully as I could, prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I've tried to anticipate the things that the negative is going to say, and I've tried to give you a piece of evidence to answer that. But there's a formal process of FMS. It has 5 steps, and step 5 is delivery. And an FMS sale is called an FMS case, and that case is not closed until there is delivery. And so all the way through the delivery of the defense materials and defense services, the case is open, that sale is still going on, and because of evidence that you've seen in the previous one about when it can be canceled or suspended, it can be canceled or suspended all the way up to final delivery. So the case is still live until everything's delivered and the final paperwork is completed and the payment is made, and then the case is closed. The negative says the case closes with the letter of acceptance. Letter of acceptance is the contract. So I've included a bunch of definitions from the Green Book, which has a glossary of terminology, which I think you're going to find incredibly useful. It's at the end. It's one of the appendixes to the Green Book, and it defines every term you can think of. And so several of these are definitions. You'll see the definition of FMS, of an FMS case, of a letter of offer and acceptance, of completed cases, closed cases, of contract administration. And I think after reading this, it's quite clear to me that the case is not over until the sale is, until the delivery is made. That's when the sale ends. And so reducing foreign military sales includes the reducing of the letter of acceptance, so you can't make a new contract. It stops, immediately suspends delivery of anything that's still in the pipeline, including services. And so if your counter plan is saying, well, we're not doing your plan, but we're stopping delivery, that is stopping the sale. That is not a separate part. It is the same thing. And I don't think that I've seen any evidence that suggests otherwise. I think that it is just a self-serving negative thing. The reason that I think this is important is because these two process arguments are the way the negative is going to try to construct counterplans that just do the AF. And if you can fight back against that and defend against that, then I think you're in pretty good shape with affirmatives. And I think then the negative has to pivot back to what I actually believe are better negative arguments. Counterplans to reform the sales, to try to get the country to behave better but keep the sales going, and then the supplier shift genre of DAs and the influence style of DAs, which is what the literature is really, that's what the negative literature is. We gotta make our arms sales better, but let's not cut them off. So I think that's helpful. All right, in the few minutes I have left, I'm gonna kind of just go through this quickly. So Roman numeral 3 is my map of the topic. I've shared this with my students, but I think it's a really useful way to break down the topic. I'm only going to talk about the side of the topic that is trying to be topical. You can do a similar process for the side of the topic that is not trying to be topical, or which is critiquing topicality. But on the side of the topic that is trying to be topical, I would divide the AFs into 3 main categories: country-specific AFs, weapon-specific AFs, and program-wide AFs, programmatic change AFs. Within country-specific, I would further subdivide into major purchasers. Those major purchasers would be the top 10 or 12 or whatever that meets the generally accepted topicality substantially interpretation. This would be Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Taiwan and the others. Then I would have non-major purchasers that are close allies. So the other allies that are not making the top 10 list or not making the substantial threshold. A lot of these are in the European Union. And then I would finally have non-major purchasers that are not close allies. And that would be everyone who doesn't make the list who is not a close ally. Under the weapon-specific category, I would further divide it into pariah weapon cases. Those are cases that say we should stop selling a particular type of weapon and say that it's bad. Drones or PGMs or torture weapons. There's several AFs like that were written at camp. Technology transfer AFs, so AFs that are trying to stop the spread of an American technology, not because it's bad, but because it's good, and we don't want others to get it. And finally, security dilemma AFs or balance of power AFs, which sort of are in the same vein, but the problem is not that the weapon is bad, it's that it's too good and it creates a security dilemma, and so it destabilizes the region. A lot of these would be missile defense style AFs, or other defensive weapon AFs that change the balance of power. And then under the program-wide section, I would divide into human rights and risk-related AFs. Those are AFs like the Thrall and Dormany proposal, like the Code of Conduct, like the Leahy Law, AFs that are about making our review process for arms sales much more stringent in terms of human rights. I would then have a category about congressional oversight and the congressional process of approval. So those would be AFs that make it easier for Congress to overturn arms sales or give them a greater role in the arms sales process. It could make things more transparent for Congress. It could give Congress more tools to block sales. And then finally, I would have consolidation or ceiling AFs. And those are AFs that would just get rid of DCS, or that would place a cap, like our topicality argument says, on overall sales under one of the categories, or both of the categories. So a new conventional arms transfer policy, reminiscent of the Carter administration, which I actually think could be a good AF. I think that's the right way to think about the AFs. What do I think the most popular AFs will be? I think Saudi Arabia will and should be the most popular AF because it is clearly the best AF until the war in Yemen is over. I really don't know why you wouldn't read the Saudi Arabia AF, honestly. I think it's right about all the important stuff, and it's great against the process arguments and against the neg generics. I think Taiwan will and should be popular throughout the year. I don't think that the status quo about Taiwan is likely to change as much. So I think that will be a popular AF. I think it will be a very good AF. I think human rights related programmatic change AFs will be very good. I think they'll be popular. I think that teams will like it, that it's not about a specific country, so they can plug in different country modules. But I also think that human rights good is something that is a pretty good advantage. Because these are process-based, they also kind of have a good angle against process neg arguments. And I think people will like that. And then I think teams will read small AFs that are about countries that you haven't researched yet, that are not going to meet the commonly accepted substantial definitions. But I don't know if they will be successful. I don't think so, but it's possible. Usually, when the negative is really good, judges tend to be more lenient about topicality for the affirmative. And I don't think that the common understanding on this topic is that the negative is too good, and so the affirmative needs extra help. I think it's more the opposite, that the negative is in a little trouble, and that the affirmative is in very good shape. And so I think in that environment, it feels unlikely to me that those Fs are going to succeed, but you never know. Finally, I'll go through this very quickly. Roman numeral 4, here's what I think you should have on the neg when you go to your first tournament. I think you should have a couple topicality arguments. I think you should have the ceiling argument from our packet, just because it links to all the Fs. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to win it. I'm kind of curious what people decide about that. Second, I think you want to have a percentage-based substantial definition, 1%, 2%, 2.7%, 10%, 13%, there's a variety. And then I think you should have something that you would read against all the Fs that are not meeting that standard based on the most liberal interpretation of the numbers. So you should figure out what are the Fs that get above that percentage or come close. I think if it's close, the F will win. That's going to end up, based on what we did in our lab, with a list of about 15 countries. If it's not one of those 15 countries, I think you should have a T argument that you feel good about going for T against. And then you need T against non-topical F. I think you should have a few Ks. I think you should have a liberalism K, liberal pacification K style argument. You can redo or choose whichever version from the different camps that you want with the impact and alternative, but I think the link arguments, the Cooper arguments, and the Stavronakis arguments are quite good. They link to a lot of Fs, and especially they link to those smaller Fs. So those Fs that you might be going for T against, those human rights, humanitarian Fs, international humanitarian law Fs, I think that's a good critique to have in the box. I think you should have a regular security K that will link to the kinds of Fs that are more about war, the Taiwan style Fs, the Fs with big war impacts. And then I also think you should have a capitalism critique or some other kind of critique that you can read against non-topical Fs, but also that links to some topical Fs, especially economic related ones. So a cap or neoliberalism K, I think would be the third one I would suggest. Disads. Number 1, I think you should have the defense industrial base supplier shift DA. I think you should have several versions of it. I think you should have one aspect be about the United States, and then another aspect be about another country or a couple other countries. I think that it could be China, it could be Russia. I also think it could be the European countries, France, Germany, the UK. I think you could write specific disads about individual companies. I think you could have political-based or election-based impacts to these disads. But I think this is a good argument. It's not a great argument when it's very simple, and it's you've been debating against Saudi Arabia. It's a little harder against Saudi Arabia, but not necessarily. I think if you make this argument good, this can be your go-to generic throughout the year. Second is credibility and influence, good disads. It's kind of hard to write one of these generically, but I think you can write a generic version that then will allow you to more quickly produce specific versions. Ideally, you will have influence DA arguments against each specific country, but you also just want some generic arguments about how the arms trade increases American influence and how cutting off loses American influence. And I think this is particularly good against cases that stop what we would consider good sales. So sales to countries that are allies, Cato-style AFs that are like retrenchment good AFs, entanglement-style AFs. I think this is good. I think this is a good disad. Third, I would have credibility / soft power bad. It's the opposite, but I think it's very useful. I think what Tyler put together at our camp is a great start. I would use that and try to make it better. The last two I would consider would be a 2020 election DA and maybe a politics DA, but I wouldn't count on either of those being that good. I don't think that arms sales are the key issue in the 2020 election, and the politics DA tends to be bad always, but especially lately during Trump. Counterplans, I would suggest 4. I would suggest a reform counterplan or a set of reform counterplans that do end-use monitoring, stronger risk assessment, more follow-through with conditions that are already on the books, to make sure that countries don't misuse the weapons and they don't disperse the weapons illegally. Ideally, you would have several proposals that could be tailored to different apps. The net benefit is the defense industrial base / supplier shift DA, because you can keep selling, but you can control the impact via an intervention that doesn't require cutting off sales. Second, I think you should have leverage counterplans, but I don't think it's possible to do this generically. I do think it's possible to put together a generic set of materials that then will make it easier and more quicker to develop case-specific ones. So like the leverage counterplanning in Saudi Arabia is fine. I don't think it's great. I think you could make it a little better, but against smaller countries, maybe you could have an argument that is better, because the answer for the Saudi app is quite good. The answer to the other apps that are much smaller with smaller literature bases probably is not nearly as good. Then you want some advantage counterplans. You got to make sure they don't link to your influence DA and your supplier shift DA. And then maybe you want to try to find a process counterplan. I don't know what that is yet. If it's topic specific, hopefully you can find it. Finally, a couple things about the case. I think you should develop an FMS DCS not key set of core materials. We've got a good start with some of the circumvention files that are here at our camp. I think you should take a look at what other camps have produced. I think you should look at the resources that I've provided about VPC, and I think you should do more research on that, and I think you should do research in the context of specific countries. Second, I think you should do some specific case work, case strategies against the most common apps. I would say that includes Saudi Arabia / UAE, Taiwan, the human rights process apps, and then you can, if you have time and the ability, and if you're on a little bit larger squad, you can probably do all 12 apps that someone has written at the camp. And then finally, I would think about some impact turns, the ones that we thought of based on our review of the camp apps. Hegemony, both ways, but especially hegemony, bad. Credibility, bad, but you already kind of have that on your list as a dissat. And then international humanitarian law, bad. Or international law, bad, something like that. But there might be more. But I think if you go to your first tournament with that in the box, you will be prepared to succeed. I think you'll be on the right track, and I think you'll have a successful season. So I think this is a good topic. I've really enjoyed learning about it. I think it's a lot more process-oriented than I initially thought. I think that there are some process issues that are going to become important because of the argument culture, and because of the negatives attempt to write a counterplan that just does the plan. I think if you educate yourself about the process, and if you have this toolkit to go back to and research process throughout the year, that you will be in a much better position than students that do not dive in. So really take advantage of those resources at the top. That's the place to go when you need to cut process cards. There's so much process stuff there, it's nearly limitless. So I hope that this was helpful. There were some other things that I wanted to say, but I think I got through most of it. So that's the topic lecture 2.0.